Welcome to the second episode of this series dealing with six thinkers that really shaped my life and I think the Jewish world as well. And we start with Rav Shimshon Rafael Hirsch. Rav Hirsch was born in 1808 in Hamburg in Germany. His father was a merchant, but what did Rav Hirsch see him doing throughout his life? Torah was his father's life. That was where he spent so much of his spare time to make sure he himself was learned in the Torah, in Gemara, and other parts of Jewish tradition. And Hirsch himself was educated as a pupil of Chacham Isaac Bernays. And the influence of his father and, of course, his education drove him to want to become a rabbi. And he received smicha from Chacham Bernays in 1830. He then went to the University of Bonn to get his university education. And he was a student there with Abraham Geiger. And they became friends and organized events together. Abraham Geiger later became his enemy, not enemy in that sort of way, because Geiger was the founder of Reform Judaism, which, of course, as we'll see both this week and later on in our thoughts, was a major challenge for Shimshon Rafael Hirsch. About that time as well, he became the chief rabbi of Oldenburg, his first position as a rav in a community. And then he began to write. In 1836, he published his first work, 19 Letters. And 19 Letters was written under a pseudonym, an Uziel, and it was a remarkable piece of work. When you read it today, you really see it as the first ever outreach publication. What was he doing? Reform was gaining massively. There was assimilation was rising across Europe. He saw himself as the champion of the defense of orthodoxy. And he wrote this book as a conversation between a rabbi and a student, discussing questions and really getting to grips with the challenges of being a Jew in the modern world. And it made a huge impression on German Jewry. And then in 1838, he published Horeb. This was his philosophy of Jewish law and observances. And what's interesting is that he actually finished Horeb before he finished the 19 Letters. Yet his publishers said to him, first go with 19 Letters, because they were worried with reform so much in vogue, Horeb would not be read by anybody. But if you start with 19 Letters and really show people sort of what you are, how you're trying to get over to them, they will also love Horeb. And that's what happened. Horeb also became a huge success. It explained to people in modern language what are our traditions, what are our observances, what are halachot. In 1839, he wrote his first polemical essay against Geigen reform, which, as I said, became a major part of his whole struggle in his life to fight and defend tradition. He moved in 1841 to Hanover, where he became the chief rabbi of Auschwitz and Osnabrück. Again, you can see he moved from place to place to really spread his Torah and inspire the people around him. And then in 1843, a very interesting anecdote. He applied to be the chief rabbi of Great Britain and the Commonwealth. There were 13 candidates. He got down to the final four, but eventually he lost to Chief Rabbi Nathan Marcus Adler. And again, I always think to myself, what it would have been to have Shimshon Rafael Hirsch as the chief rabbi. Rav Adler was an unbelievable chief rabbi as well, but to think of the caliber that he must have been to have beaten Rav Hirsch in that runoff. In 1846, Hirsch was called by Nikolsburg and Moravia, two areas of Austria and Germany, to become the chief rabbi of Moravia and Austria-Silesia. And while he was there, he was caught in the middle between the reformers on the one side, who felt his orthodoxy was, too difficult for them, and they wanted to sort of change things and reform things and move away from those things, and also traditionalists who believed what he was suggesting with his ideology of Torah Derech Eretz was too controversial. As always, we find people who are caught in the middle find it difficult, but that voice needs to be said, and Rav Hirsch continued to say that voice despite the animosity on both sides of the equation. And then in 1851, he accepted the call from Orthodox separatists in Frankfurt am Main, a community that had detached itself from the main community, which was basically reformed to form an Orthodox community, and they wanted him to lead them, and he agreed. It was a large community of 500 families, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. He dedicated the rest of his life to building Frankfurt, to build a community in his ideology of Torah Derech Eretz. He built a school, training for rabbis, and really threw himself into the life and soul of the community. He wrote Yeshurun, which was a weekly publication defending and explaining Jewish tradition. And obviously, as I said, so many times having to write against the reform and against the sort of anti-Orthodox movement spreading up across Europe. Also during this time, despite his communal responsibilities and his sort of worldly responsibilities with defending Judaism, defending Orthodoxy, he managed to write his commentaries on the Siddur, on the Chumash, and on Tehillim. Remarkable. For somebody to be able to write that level and that depth of work while having all the pressures of running a community and doing everything he was doing shows what a remarkable man he was. In 1876, there was a secession bill, which allowed the community to legally move away from the organized Jewish community, which was, as I said, reform. The question was, do you have to move away? Or you can now move away. Rav Hirsch believed, yes, you had to absolutely move away from the community. Rav Bamberger, the Rav of Würzburg, said no. As long as the community makes appropriate arrangements for orthodoxy, then we can stay as part of the wider community. The two of them disagreed vehemently, and a terrible rift was caused between Rav Hirsch and Rav Bamberger, between two sides of the Orthodox community, which basically much stayed until the Frankfurt community, unfortunately, was almost destroyed during the Second World War. In 1888, Hirsch died in Frankfurt. And when you think back now to the life he lived, what he caused, what he fought for, his ideals, his ideology, had a massive impact, not just on his time, but on the time up till today. We'll start looking at those ideas next week. See you next Monday.